Development referred to the committee on Tuesday, November 7th.
From the Office of the Auditor General, Jerry V. DeMarco, Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Kimberly Leach, Principal, and Matthew Lequin, Principal. Nice to have you in today. From the Department of the Environment, Jean-François Tremblay, Deputy Minister, Vincent Arn, Assistant Deputy Minister, Climate Change Branch, and John Moffat, Associate Secretary to the Cabinet, Economic and Regional Development Policy. Do I have all that right? I think that's correct. Oh.
So
Go ahead, yes.
I'm John Moffat, Assistant Deputy Minister, Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Okay.
And my colleague from PCO is...
Oh, okay. All right. You're right. I would have picked that up in a second here. From the Privy Council Office, Alexis Conrad, Associate Secretary to the Cabinet, Economic and Regional Development Policy. Pardon me. I'm glad you spoke up. I saw a few head nodding there and realized something was amiss. So apologies for that. I'm glad we got that corrected for the record. You'll each have each organization will have an opening statement. Although we are starting late, I think we're going to proceed with that. So, Mr. DeMarco, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're happy to appear before your committee to discuss our November 2023 report on the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan, which was developed by Environment and Climate Change Canada under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. I would like to acknowledge that this hearing is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. With me today is Kimberly Leach, who was responsible for the audit. Also with me today is Mathieu Lequin, who was responsible for the 2024 Net Zero Accelerator audit, which I understand is also of interest to the committee. Emissions in Canada are higher today than when this country and the world first committed to fighting climate change at the United Nations Earth Summit more than 30 years ago. Plans have come and gone, and Canada has yet to meet any of its targets. Meanwhile, the need to reverse the trend on Canada's greenhouse gas emissions has grown only more pressing. This is not my first time sounding this alarm, and I will continue to do so until Canada turns the tide. While we were not required to begin reporting on the implementation of the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan until the end of 2024, we decided to move more quickly, given the urgency of climate change. Overall, we found that the plan was insufficient to meet Canada's target to reduce emissions by 40 to 45% below the 2005 level by 2030. We found that measures needed to meet the 2030 target were delayed by departments or were not prioritized for implementation. We also found a lack of reliability and transparency in economic and emission modeling, leading the government to make overly optimistic assumptions about emission reductions. I was also concerned to find that responsibility for reducing emissions was fragmented among multiple federal entities not directly accountable to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. This means that the Minister has no authority to commit other entities to reduce emissions to meet the target. La bonne nouvelle est que certaines mesures du...
On a positive note, some measures in the plan have great potential. If stringent enough and applied widely, carbon pricing and regulations may support deep emission reductions. We expect to issue our next report under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act this fall. In it, we will assess government actions in 3 areas: implementing specific emission reduction measures, advancing our recommendations, and public reporting on progress. In closing, I want to emphasize again that the window to avoid catastrophic climate change is closing fast. Intense forest fires, smoke-filled skies, heat waves, violent storms, and flooding are becoming more severe and frequent and affecting people all across Canada. Taking meaningful action to reduce emissions is the most impactful thing Canada can do to play its part in addressing the global climate emergency. Solutions exist, such as implementing effective fiscal and regulatory measures to reduce greenhouse gases. The problem is that available solutions are being implemented much too slowly. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening statement. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee might have. Thank you. Thank you once again. Mr. Tremblay, 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will try to be brief.
Also Tremblay, I'm the Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm pleased to be speaking with you today here on the Parliament Hill on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I would like to thank the Commissioner for the report and for the quality of the report. I would also say that it's actually an important audit for us. As he mentioned, everyday Canadians are seeing growing impact of cost of climate change. I'm talking and thinking about people like firefighters, first responders, Indigenous peoples, and people in Western communities like Fort McMurray in Alberta and Fort Nelson in BC, who are asking themselves what kind of forest fire season they will get this year. This audit is important because it reiterates the urgency to act. It's also important because it provides even more transparency on the government's effort to reduce emissions. As the Commissioner pointed out, little time is left to achieve our goals by 2030. However, I would like to come back on some elements that I think are positive. The report was released before the ERP of last year. And if you look at the ERP for the first time, we have a report that is showing that we will exceed the old targets of 30% by 30, which was not the case, and we were far from there a few years ago. We will also exceed the 20% reduction by 2026. Furthermore, the 2024 National Inventory report indicates that Canadian emissions are continuing to drop. In 2002, emissions were at 44 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions below pre-pandemic. This is the lowest level ever since 25 years. Of course, if you eliminate the 2 years of COVID. Regardless of those progress, we agree that we have not a lot of time in front of us and that more effort is needed. Aujourd'hui, je veux donc réitérer au comité que...
Today, I want to reiterate that my department is in favor with the report, whether it be what the Commissioner is suggesting, whether it be in transparency, quality of the report, actions, development and implementation of new regulation, reinforcement of existing regulations, or reinforcing our ability to model GHG emissions. So these are the points that I wanted to highlight.
With my colleagues to answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last, Mr. Conrad, over to you for 5 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie beaucoup de me donner le...
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear before you today. I'd like to highlight as well that this is on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe.
Sustainable development has a critical role under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act in examining and reporting on the government's implementations of emissions reduction actions. We very much appreciate the Commissioner's work and role on this important topic. We welcome the Commissioner's team's constructive engagement with the Privy Council Office throughout the audit. Privy Council Office is working to continuously improve our approach towards meeting Canada's climate objectives, and the Commissioner's work will help us do so. La loi canadienne sur la responsabilité en matière de carbone.
The Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act sets out a regular cycle of climate planning, reporting, analysis, and transparency. As Canada works towards its goal of net zero emissions. By design, this allows for continuous improvement in our efforts to meet Canada's climate objectives and execute on the requirements under the Act. This first audit provides a helpful baseline and important insights into the government's collective work in this area.
Council Office, which I lead as Assistant Secretary, supports Cabinet consideration of climate and environmental policies. To better support that work, PCO created a Climate Secretariat in the spring of 2021. The Secretariat supports Cabinet consideration of climate policies. It also provides integrated analysis, advice, and reporting to senior leadership and to the Prime Minister and his office, and supports interdepartmental coordination of the government's actions to address climate change. L'une des recommandations de l'audit vise le BCP, une autre.
One of the audit's recommendations is directed at PCO, and a second one is shared between PCO and Environment and Climate Change Canada. I'm pleased to report that we are on track to implement both recommendations.
Those recommendations ask PCO to work with other federal entities to review the authorities, responsibilities, and leadership accountabilities relating to climate change mitigation. Based on its review, it should develop an action plan for changes needed to ensure that climate change mitigation is prioritized and should make the action plan publicly available. En réponse à cette recommandation, le BCP est favorable à
In response to the audit, PCO is supportive of a review to ensure that the authorities, responsibilities, and leadership accountabilities remain as effective as possible. Areas and instruments that could be leveraged include mandate letters, cabinet committee structures and assignments, and alignments of ministerial and departmental powers, duties, and functions.
PCO's Machinery of Government Secretariat is undertaking a process of assessing existing legislative authorities that touch on climate change mitigation, is also examining existing decision-making processes.
PCO also shares a recommendation with Environment and Climate Change Canada, which directs us to make substantive information from what was then called the Integrated Climate Lens publicly available.
Under ETRIPLE's leadership and with PCO's support, Cabinet has recently adopted a new directive that requires departments to apply a climate, nature, and environment and economy lens to policy proposals that they bring to Cabinet or propose for funding. The lens aims to provide ministers with high-quality environmental information as well as economic analysis to support the government's decision-making. Mr. Chair, tackling climate change is a priority for the government, and PCO has provided and continues to provide an important contribution towards this work. Our team brings officials together from across government to help find solutions to complex policy questions. Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie.
Mr. Chair, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Merci à vous aussi.
Thanks to you as well.
We'll begin with Mr. Mazier. The first four questioners have 6 minutes each. You have 6 minutes, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the witnesses coming out this afternoon. The Commissioner's report listed the Net Zero Accelerator Fund as a measure to meet the government's emissions reductions targets. Commissioner, has the government revealed to you what the internal emission reduction target is for the $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund? Yes or no?
So thank you for the question. We anticipate that there would be some questions regarding our new Net Zero Accelerator Initiative report, and Monsieur Lequin is here to address those questions.
It was just a simple yes or no. Have you seen that?
Yes. Yes.
You have.
Yes.
So what is it?
This is cabinet confident, so we cannot share this information. You have to ask the department.
I can't hear him, Chair.
Oh, sorry. So I'll move closer to the mic. So yes, we have seen the number, and this number is in it's cabinet confident. It's in the MC and TBS.
So you can't tell us what the $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund is reducing by emissions because of cabinet confidence.
So in the
It's a
report,
secret?
I'm sorry.
Like, So who in cabinet, what department gave you that that letter?
I said, innovation, science, economic development.
Okay.
However, we noted in the report that in the ECCC modeling, the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative is expected to have a 19 to 20 megaton reduction in the
Okay, so Mr. Tremblay, my question is simple. What is the government's emission reduction target for specifically for the $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund?
I think the answer has to be, and the question has to be asked to my colleagues that I said. I'm sorry.
So, Deputy Minister, your minister, in his mandate letter, actually states, and here I'll read it to you, support the Minister of Innovation and Science and in the implementation of the Net Zero Accelerator Initiative with the emphasis on ensuring that investments drive industrial transition and significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. That's in his mandate letter. And you can't tell me anything about the targets, internal targets for this fund for $8 billion.
As it was said, there was numbers that were included in the ERP regarding exactly the functions and how it works for these programs. The accountability is with the Department of ISET. We're there to support them, but we're not there to speak on their behalf on their programs and the way they manage them. So it would be more appropriate for the departments of ISET to answer these questions.
Mr. Major, just hold on. I'm going to ask the clerk to just turn the volume up. I'm getting reports from people who can't hear online and in the room. So if we can get the volume turned up significantly so we can hear what's going on clearly, I'd appreciate it. I'm just going to wait till that's done. And Mr. Major, you'll have 3 minutes remaining on the clock. No, just hold on. I want to get confirmation. I've got several notes from people who are having trouble hearing. And I will talk. Is it possible to turn the volume up in the room?
I'm asking.
Okay, thank you. No. Just hold on. He is a deputy. Is that better? Is that better? Is that better? Should we give it a go again?
I can always hear you. It seems to be those down there.
All right. Well,
We'll try Mr.
go ahead.
Tremblay again.
You have 3 minutes.
So, Mr. Tremblay, do you know the target?
The documents that were shared with the auditor are documents that they share. I didn't see those documents. I'm not the ones who participated in the collection of the comments.
Do you know the target?
I
You
don't know.
So you're
I came here for an audit on something different, and you're raising an issue about the Net Zero Accelerator, which I think should be answered by my colleagues.
Yes, so that on this, I'm glad you brought that up because this is report 6 that the commissioner did. In it, there's a whole host of different type of projects that are to reduce emissions in Canada. We're talking about one of these out of all these lists. There's a Net Zero Accelerator. It's right there. It's in this fund, $8 billion. And you don't know the target, the emissions reduction target for $8 billion.
I'm telling you that it is more appropriate for the Department of ISET to answer your questions about how they manage their programs, the objective of their programs, and the result they expect. This is our accountability works.
You are the top official in Environment Climate Change Canada. It's responsible for emissions reductions, and you don't know the target.
I'm telling you that if they didn't give if they didn't give you the information, it's not for me to reveal the information, whatever it is. It's for them to do it.
Do you think the Canadians deserve a right to know?
No comments. I'm not even part of those discussions, so that I think it's more appropriate to ask our friend at ISET to answer that questions.
Okay. Much time, Chair?
90 seconds.
That's good. I'll pass.
All right. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today.
Mr. DeMarco, did the Government of Canada provide all the requested information to CESD?
Are we back to the Net Zero Act, or are we still on the Net Zero Accelerator?
Well, we're in this report, the act.
The Act. And so I'll ask Ms. Leach, the principal responsible for this audit, to return to the table and assist with this. Ms. Leach was the principal responsible for the Net Zero Act report.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So there is a section in our act that deals with the provision of information. And there were some instances where we did talk about the lack of available information. And there were a couple of instances there where we ran into some trouble. One was with regard to some information that we were looking for on an integrated climate lens. And we were looking for this information because it had the economic modeling together with the climate change greenhouse gas modeling. So we were looking to see whether these decisions were policy coherent as a result of that. But some of that information was not available to us and is not publicly available due to cabinet confidence and budget information reasons. So we did make a recommendation on that and to PCO and Environment and Climate Change Canada, which they agreed to. So some of that information will be shared in the future in summary form, which had been mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Tremblay, are there issues with Canada's emissions modeling, and if so, what is being done to improve the modeling?
On modeling, is not an issue with modeling. Modeling is something that is always going in progress. So when we do modeling, it's something that, as the commissioner asked us, it's something that we work on to make sure that it's actually as good and accurate as possible. We have sent 5 biannual reports to the United Nations on using our modeling. 5 times it has been reviewed by international experts, and it passed the test. We do work with modelers, experts, to try to improve the modeling. The modeling is a complex thing, but it's a complex work, but it is something that we continuously doing and continuously review. For example, our modelers are now having a meeting today or this week with external modelers, as it was suggested by the commissioner, to precisely compare modeling's expertise and compares how they arrive to their own results. So it is something that we're doing. We don't pretend that we're perfect on modeling, but the modeling that we're doing is internationally recognized as actually good.
Okay, and are there efforts being made to improve the speed with which the NIR is reported?
It is something that was raised by the commissioner, and in some countries on how fast they are able to actually provide information on the emissions for recent years. We are working on this. We said that we will be doing some work with Statistics Canada. The team is working on this. Our scientists are looking at it and looking at what could be done and what would be the cost benefit of this. Like everybody else, we would like to have the information as soon as possible. So we're looking at ways that we can accelerate the time it takes to get the information about emission reductions or emissions issue.
Okay, thank you. So for Mr. Conrad, recommendation number 6.79 concerns the fragmentation of responsibilities regarding the reduction of emissions. How can the Canadian Carbon Neutrality Accountability Act be monitored when no minister or other party is responsible for meeting reduction targets?
So, Mr. Chair, so first of all, thank you for the question. We worked with the commissioner on this recommendation. We agree there is space to clarify accountabilities. We are going through a process to review those. It's actually an ongoing process. At any given point, we work to make sure ministerial accountabilities are clear. Different ministers clearly have responsibility for different programs. They have legal responsibilities. They've been mandated through mandate letters by the Prime Minister. The Minister of the Environment and Climate Change does have responsibility for the Act and for parts of the Act, but there are numerous contributions coming from different ministers with clear accountabilities for their responsibilities given either by Parliament or directed by the Prime Minister. We're confident that the system works, but we are also confident there's opportunity for us to keep reviewing the process to make sure those lines of accountability are as clear as possible. And that's something we're doing now and will continue to do over the months ahead, and we've committed to that through the Management Action Plan.
So you've mentioned that you're excited to implement some of the upcoming recommendations and prepare them for implementation. How do you ensure that implementing the recommendations leads to actually having them followed through on?
So as we go through the process, for example, ministerial mandate letters, we track very closely the responsibilities and the commitments that ministers have been asked for. As PCO, we provide, keep track closely of initiatives that are moving forward when timelines have been put in budgets or in policy documents, and we track this quite closely. We gather information when items come to cabinet. We make sure that they're vetted through that process. And we keep very good, close eye on the commitments the government's made and are very careful to make sure that ministerial accountabilities are kept where they're needed.
So why not proceed as the United Kingdom has done with monitoring under the responsibility of a committee reporting to Parliament? And why would such a change require like a full year's reflection?
So I can't speak for the British system. It's something the Commissioner flagged. It's something we agreed through the process to look at. I'm working with my colleagues in machinery of government part of the Privy Council office on that. I wouldn't prejudge the outcome of their deliberations, but certainly there are different models in different governments, and we often look at the UK for how they're doing things, given the nature of their system is so closely mirrored with ours.
Ms. Bradford, your time's up. If you have a follow-up question, I'll allow that, but if not, it's something new.
It was
okay.
a new
Okay, yeah,
tangent.
if
Thank
you could hold till next round. Thank you. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés, s'il vous plaît.
Mrs. Sinclair de Gagné, 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the witnesses. Mr. DeMarco, I'm going to begin with a question for you. Oftentimes in your report that is very well written, we find nuggets hidden in some paragraphs. If I look at paragraph 40, we formulated recommendations, similar recommendations, many times over the past 20 years. So the recommendations that you're making, report after report, you make these recommendations, similar ones, and you're observing that the department accepts the recommendations but doesn't follow up in a significant way. Could you give us an example? I'd like to hear you speak on this. Yes? So with modeling, for example, that we just spoke about, our office and our main director, Mrs. Leach, was part of many different audits over the past 2 decades. And the problem with modeling is that, for an example, there was a series of recommendations where the department accepted them, but we don't then see enough progress in order to improve the situation. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Tremblay, do you have any response to this? I mean, it's quite obvious that for 20 years now, similar recommendations have been made. The department says, oh, yes, 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 but doesn't really do anything to remedy the problem. Are things going to change, or are you going to say yes, yes, yes? And then next year, we're going to have, again, similar recommendations and similar observations. Modeling is something that is constantly reviewed, as I was saying, every 2 years. We have to send a report to the UN. We report to our peers, and we began, and especially after the audit, we implemented a forum of experts, external experts. We compare the practices and the modeling. We've been doing that. We're going to continue. It doesn't mean that the model is perfect. We recognize that. And we are constantly trying to see how we can do things. And as I was saying earlier, all the accredited experts by UNFCCC, the UN, who looked at our modeling frameworks, found that it was passing the test, and so we are improving. It's a constant exercise for it's continuous improvement, and we are improving consistently on the quality of our modeling. And so that is why you see changes year after year. Sometimes in the calculations is because we take into account new approaches and new information that's been provided. Thank you, but everything you've just said has been judged insufficient by another peer who is reporting, and that is the Commissioner to Sustainable Development, C034, the lack of reliability of projections of emissions. 37, we've noted that the peer review was insufficient. You say that you do this, but it's judged or deemed insufficient. So are you going to do more? We're going to continue to work hard and to make sure that the Commissioner at some point will agree with the efforts that we're making. He spoke about efforts, said that it's not sufficient. We continue to work, and we want to make sure that we're going to meet the highest standards, and I hope that at some point the Commissioner will agree with us. I'm going to control my own microphone. Thank you. Mr. DeMarco, do you think that at this rate you'll ever be in agreement with what Mr. Tremblay just said? Or do you believe that at the speed that changes are being made, that will never happen? So I would like to see them reach their objective, their target, and that they be able to improve their modeling. Am I sure that it's going to happen and that I will agree with the department?
It's point of order if you want attention. I don't just look for random comments. Yes, I know you're anxious to get out. I'm looking for UC to, the bells are ringing for 30 minutes. Looking for UC to continue for another 20 before we suspend to vote. Do I have UC to continue? Yes, sir. Thank you. All right, I will watch the clock. And Mr. DeMarco, you're welcome to take it from the top if you like. You have time, and je vais ajouter le temps.
Alors, en sommaire, on verra.
So we will see. I'm not sure if I will agree or not. How about what's your confidence level? Is it good after these years? I haven't been confident up until now, so we'll see. I want to see a reduction year over year, a reduction of emissions aiming towards the targets. So we're focused on results, and we need to see results. Thank you. Mr. Tremblay, a quick question. Are you aware of the budget of your the department budget? 2.7 billion, I think. It depends. There's been some changes. Do you know how much Canada sent in 2022 in fossil fuel subsidies? 51.5 billion. Do you find that this scale is satisfactory? It's not up to me to judge. Was this for decarbonization? I'm not sure what this is for. Well, perhaps, but given the profit of these businesses, it could be judged as something quite indecent if you're looking at net zero, especially for an industry that is making billions in profit. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have? 20 seconds. Okay. It must be frustrating for you to see that more money is spent in helping oil and gas companies, and even if you really wanted to help them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, what we see is that in your objectives there was only 6 or 5 on the 80 that were targeting the oil sector, and it's the highest emission. So it seems like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. Well, we're working on regulation for methane. We also have oil and gas capture. These are measures that are targeting the fossil fuel sector. And when we work on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we have to work with the entire industry. Well, perhaps you're not working hard enough.
It's Mr. Desjardins for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Growing up, I often heard a phrase from many of the elders in a very small rural Indigenous community I grew up, which was that young people, particularly children, that this planet and this place and this earth is more theirs than it is ours, and that we have a responsibility to that principle to know that those who act and those who are stewarding this land have a really real and very tangible connection to the next generation, and the fact that they'll have to deal with many of these things. As a more recently elected member of parliament, I'm sure our witnesses could sympathize with the many stories I hear, the fear of young people. Every single school I go to speak to and visit with, a young person comes up to me and will ask me a question as to whether or not enough is being done to make sure that they can have a livable planet. That they fear that the smoke and wildfire that took over much of Canada last year will become the new norm, that the historic floods that we're seeing in some parts of the region, like we've seen in British Columbia, that destroyed our supply chains, could become the new norm, that the immensely dry conditions that threaten cities like Fort McMurray, Yellowknife, and albeit much of Edmonton will continue to get worse. It's a serious issue, and one that I think we owe young people the most credible answer to, even if that answer is one of failure. But I also do believe that these audits, and most particularly the audit presented today, makes clear where we are and where we need to go. I'm disappointed in a few facts. One, the report makes suggestions that we've had now 10 climate change mitigation plans since 1990, and Canada's current emissions are significantly higher than what they were in 1990. What we heard today, and what I mentioned by the members of the government, particularly Environment Canada, is that there is a lack of centralized authority. To the contest of the member from the Privy Council who said that they are the ones who act in the centralizing work of institutions, the audit makes clear that both in effect, but also in reality, we're not seeing any tangible changes. It's clear to me, and I think it's clear to Environment and Climate Change Canada, that projects in its own words that Canada is going to miss its target for reducing emissions. And again, these are the things we have to tell young people. In addition to this, in December of 2022, the department revised the emissions reduction it expected from the 2030 plan from achieving 36.4% below the 2005 level to 34%, missing the 2030 target by an even larger margin. This is, in my mind, the moving of goalposts, which don't seek to actually reduce emissions, but seek to try to prevent what it would be a better level of accountability. In regard to the audit, it makes suggestion that only 45% of the measures in the plan had an implementation deadline. My question is to the audit team, what measures did not have an implementation deadline that are of most importance to actually achieving emissions reductions, please?
Thank you for the question. Principal Leach will address that.
Yes, so thank you for the question. In paragraph 6.26 and in Exhibit 6.5, we talk about the 80 emission reduction measures in the plan, and we point out that that there was no deadline for about half of them. And the ones that did have a deadline were mostly the regulations, because that you have to do a regulatory impact statement when you're proposing a regulation. So those deadlines and those emission reductions were fairly clear. We also noted there that 95% of the measures, of those 80 measures, did not have an emission reduction target. So
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No, that's deeply disappointing and a bit disturbing to me that something as serious as climate change and the crisis that faces Canadians in drier conditions, well, albeit all over the globe, but the fact that we're now experiencing it, we're truly in an age of consequence. I was a young person, I experienced a wildfire, and I know how devastating that can be for rural people, for Indigenous people, and for those who have to succumb to its smoke. It's pretty devastating, and it leads to lifelong impacts, both to psychology, but also to one's own feeling of safety and security, which is why I find these audits so difficult for me to be able to understand the grave severity of the consequences of not acting sooner. And I think this act, which is intended to provide some kind of clarity, to me speaks more of an agenda of political theater than it does to actually reduce emissions. You know, one part of the act, for example, does not require the minister to achieve targets, but simply explain why targets were not met. You know, that to me, like the fact that we had to write that in the act, that the minister would have these powers, speaks to just the lack of ingenuine nature that I think the act provides a framework for. To the Deputy Minister of Environment, what explanation do you have to young people in my riding and across Canada for the audit that you see here today, and what is, I think, a pretty glaring, I guess, litmus test for how far away we actually are from achieving a reality for Canadians, but most particularly to young Canadians who have to deal with these facts, hear that the audit has failed them, and what are your response to them?
So first of all, I want to maybe, and thanks for your question. As a grandfather, I have the same questions. I'm asking the same questions on how I would approach those issues. Let's come back on a few things. I didn't say that the targets have changed or commitment in the targets for 2030 is still the same. The second thing is on the 30...
So the department said that, sorry, if I can respond, the department revised the emission reductions.
No, what the 34 and the 36%, what you have there is information that based on modeling and on the existing measures that are in place and measures that are being implemented, we assess that we will be at 36.2%, which means that we still need to do more to get 40 to 45. But we never said that we don't want 40, 45. So that's something to change. The other thing I would tell you on this is we have since 1990, and all the efforts that were made by different governments, decreased the carbon intensity of the economy. But it took really too much time to arrive to the tipping point where the emissions were reducing themselves, because the economy, as you know, go up, the population goes up, and even if you go with less intensity, you end up with more emissions. We've turned that curve for the first time. What you have in reality in 2022, it's a reduction. You're seeing a reduction in the emissions.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
that's what
Tremblay.
you've been saying, and that's what we're saying.
Thank you. I'm sure we'll come back to this. I do want to get two others in before we suspend. Mr. Major, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Tremblay, the government gave away $700 million to a company by the name of PowerCo through the Net Zero Accelerator Fund. PowerCo is owned by Volkswagen Group, a German company that made over $476 billion, that's with a B, $476 billion in revenue last year. How many emissions are supposed to be reduced directly from the $700 million handout?
I don't have the information, and that's a question to ask the people who manage the programs, as I told you before.
You are the Deputy Minister of Environment?
I am the Deputy Minister of Environment, but I'm not responsible for all programs that are managed under the federal government.
So who is responsible?
The Deputy Minister of ISED is the one who should answer your questions about the agreements they have with this business and why it's not convenient. It's actually...
Order. Order. Mr. Major, you have 4 minutes.
So I'll ask another one, and I'm sure you got the same excuse. The government gave away $61 million to a company by the name of Pratt & Whitney through their Net Zero Accelerator Fund. Pratt & Whitney is owned by RTX, an American company worth over $190 billion. How many emissions are supposed to be reduced directly from the $61 million handout?
It's the same answer.
You have no idea. And what's most frustrating, you're so flippant about it. You don't even care. So prove it.
Okay, I do care.
What is the goal? How many emissions? Was there even any targets?
I also care about accountability. I will not accept other.
Do you? So you would think the head cheese on environment and climate change should absolutely know how many emissions are being reduced by especially by $8 billion program. You think you should be a little bit concerned about that?
This is not for me to comment on this, and you know that. You have to talk with the departments who's managing the programs. They're the ones who are responsible and accountable for this program. And that's the way it always has been.
Okay. You gave the parliamentary budget officer a copy of the government's impact report on the carbon tax. However, in your letter on behalf of Minister Guilbeault, you stated, and I quote, "I request that you ensure that this information is used for your office internal purpose only and is not published for further distributed," end quote. Why is Minister Guilbeault keeping this carbon tax report secret from Canadians?
We didn't give a carbon tax report. What we gave to the PBO, it's basic data. It's a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheets of information. And some of this information has not been published. And that's why, and sometimes it could be protected by certain act like the Statistical Act. So as we always do with the PBO, we want to make sure he's got all the information for him to provide and to develop his own analysis. So we gave him the information and we put this request that he doesn't distribute the information, use it for his analysis and make sure that it's useful for him, but not necessarily releasing it.
Could you table that report with the committee?
It's not a report. It's a decision that the governments will have to do. We can do the due diligence, and the decision can be
Could you
made.
table that?
Sorry?
Could you table that?
I'm not in a position to table it at this stage.
Who would be?
It's a decision that the governments will have to be made. Will have to
So
make.
what
not
government? The Privy of Mr. Conrad, would he be in charge of that?
C'est une décision qui devra être prise par les.
It's a decision that has to be made by government authorities. Matt, thank you very much. You have the time to answer. It's a decision that has to be made by the government as such, that would indeed include discussions with the central agencies. Our role as officials is to ensure that in the information that is disclosed, that there has been due diligence done on what is confidential or not. But the decision is the government's at the end of the day to whether to publish or not. It's not a report, but the data in question.
Commissioner, are you concerned with the answers the Deputy Minister is talking about for this net zero accelerator?
Yes, in general, I am, in terms of the principle of transparency. If Canada were a country that was showing that it could meet targets, set targets, meet targets, set targets, meet targets, and we didn't necessarily need to see what was going wrong because nothing was going wrong, then maybe even I would agree they should still be transparent. But it's even more important that they be transparent with a track record of failure after failure after failure. Transparent with peers in terms of modeling, transparent with Canadians in terms of targets. All of this is important. I don't have any specific comment about the document or the Excel sheet that you're speaking of, but increased transparency is something that our office is concerned about, and it's a theme in several of our reports, including this one.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weiler, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I do want to thank the witnesses for being here today and some familiar faces from the time I was, I had the honor of sitting on the Standing Committee of Environment and Sustainable Development. Commissioner DeMarco, given that this report was tabled, I guess, over a year ago now, and I think actually we had you at the Envy Committee to talk about it. In the time since then, with the responses of the government to your report, and also the recent policy and program responses that the government has brought in with respect to climate change, would the conclusions, any of the major conclusions of your report change today if you were doing the report today?
Thank you for the question. Time flies, but it hasn't been a year yet. It was November, I guess, that we tabled this report. I would say that there's been no major change in the key measure, which is for existing measures, when Environment Canada models them, do they add up to 40 to 45% yet, or do they not? They still do not. It's oscillated between 36, 34, and now their latest edition from the progress report is it's back up to 36. But whether it's 34 or 36, it's still not 40 to 45. So there's still a gap to be filled there through additional measures. And I would argue that because their target it's a little bit odd. It's not a target of a number, but it's a range of 40 to 45%, that they may have to actually focus on the upper part of that range because of their historical failure to ever meet targets. So they may need to factor in a bit of a buffer and aim for something, not the bare minimum of 40, but they may need to aim for something higher. But at this rate, they're only on track for what they believe to be 36%. We actually believe that there's overly optimistic assumptions in that, and it's actually something lower than 36%.
And Commissioner, if you had to put your finger on one measure or one area that should be the priority for the government to act on to reduce emissions, what area would that be?
So I can answer that from two perspectives. One from our 2021 Lessons Learned report, and that's the conceptual level, is that stronger leadership and more effective plans would be needed. And then at a sectoral level, I can answer it from a second perspective. Canada really needs to get a handle on oil and gas and transportation. Together, they account for more than 50% of total emissions.
Well, thank you for that. I know there are a number of regulations with respect to the transportation sector with zero emissions vehicles, mandate or availability standard being chief among them. But I think you're pointing to a measure that has long been worked on but hasn't been completed yet, which is the cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector. So I do want to put that question to the to officials from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Could you provide this committee with an update on where the cap on emissions from the oil and gas sector is in the process of regulatory development?
Sure, I can respond. So the Prime Minister committed to develop the cap. We put out a discussion paper on different approaches. We then put out a regulatory framework, and the minister is committed to publish a draft of the regulations. So as you know, these regulations always have to be published twice in draft form and then in final form. And the minister is committed to publish the draft regulations this fall for comment. So we're very close to the final design of the draft regulations based on about a year of extensive engagement with various experts in the sector